Hi, everyone. My name is Ariel.
My name is Mike Avila. Let's get tonight kicked off. So it's the time of year where seasons are shifting and we gather with loved ones to share food at the dinner table. Many of us are getting time off from work and school. And it's also the time of year when we get to spend more time, more intimate time with the people that we love, and often dive into conversations that sometimes can lead to disagreement and dispute. So today we want to talk about those triggering topics and difficult discussions that sometimes surface and cause strife in our relationships. We want to hear from you this evening about how those conversations make you feel, possibly how you engage those conversations, or even ways that we avoid those conversations. And we'd also love to hear about how we can even use those conversations to create stronger bonds with our loved ones and the people that we care about. And we'd also love to hear what strategies and tools that you all use for having possibly the healthiest conversations that you can when those more challenging conversations come up. I like to consider myself a deprofessionalized restorative justice facilitator. I no longer try to employ myself in that industry. And I now prefer to align myself as a circle host in that line of work that I do. And I do it only for specific people or groups that request the work, and there's a vetting process for that work. And sometimes it's not for any harms. Sometimes it's for different things, transitions of loved ones and so on. So some of what you're going to see in my very short presentation is drawn from that line of work and that lineage of traditions and cultural practices for many peoples around the world. In my situation in particular, for indigenous practices throughout the Americas. Also, not trying to lump all of us into one group as indigenous people, but this is a fairly common thread. So you're going to see on your screen here in just a couple seconds an image. So in traditional talking circles, there will be a centerpiece. Now, of course, tonight, when we're talking about like gathering around a meal, or maybe just even over drinks, having coffee with a group of friends, or maybe it's, a full-on dinner with family and loved ones during holiday times, right? Whatever the scenario is, there's always ways to have a centerpiece, and I like to consider it as a way to ground a space, even if it's just a dinner and it doesn't seem like it's that serious. There's nothing wrong with it, right? So just a few options of things that I wanted to put on here that I use oftentimes, even with my family when we gather in Texas as a larger group. Photos of loved ones, specifically ancestors, because it'll sometimes spark conversation where younger ones in the family might ask, who is that on the table, right? Images with quotes sometimes. That is a good way to help ground a space as well. Maybe it's a quote from someone in your family, and maybe it's just a quote from someone that you're passionate about, an author, an activist, or so on, or even family artifacts, right? Sometimes you can have something that's been passed along that someone, a specific person is holding and keeping, and you're able to place that as a centerpiece. Okay, so keep those things in mind. Nothing in particular, nothing specific, but those are three little examples that I wanted to share with you that you could literally put in the middle of the table, or you could also set off, create a separate space at the entryway before you're gathering with your loved ones, or whatever your scenario might be, right? All right, so next slide. There's going to be four primary things that we are going to cover and go over. So this I'm calling listening with love. In trainings that I would do at schools for educators, or sometimes with nonprofit organizations, or even a traditional for-profit business. We call these ears, mostly because the acronym aligns with listening, right? So four things: empathize, asking questions, reflecting, rephrasing, and summarizing. Now, I know some of this can be a little like, I think this too, in my own personal life, like we don't talk like this. My tias and tios don't talk like this. My family doesn't talk like this, right? But also it's not impossible for people to learn how to talk like this, right? So quickly, the first one, empathize. I usually describe this in two different ways: sympathy and empathy. I like to look at it as sympathy is when you don't have the actual experience, but you can have feelings for someone and what they're going through. You can feel for them, you can feel bad for them, you can feel sad for them, and so on. Empathy, I like to articulate as You've actually been through the thing that someone else is going through. Therefore, you can empathize with them because you know what it's like to go through that thing, right? So having empathy for others, when you're in disagreement, is a good way to ground yourself and situate yourself in a way to be open to listening to other people's perspectives, even when we disagree with them. Next one, asking questions. This is always the first one. Counselors at schools, especially elementary schools, are really good at this, right? Asking questions like, oh, wow, I heard you just say whatever it might be. Can you tell me more about that, right? So asking questions, we're going to have some examples for that in a minute. But asking questions is a really good, basic, simple way to engage in a conversation. Before we have rebuttals, we can ask a question, a clarifying question, and then add to what we want to say and offer. The next thing, reflect and rephrase, right? So maybe Adiel and I are disagreeing over which is better, Twizzlers or candy corn, and we're disagreeing on that thing. And I can, reflect and rephrase what I'm hearing that person say. And my example would be Adiel, right? I might say, okay, what I'm hearing you say is that you think Twizzlers are better than candy corn. And even inside, if I think, there's no way, she's wrong, I know candy corn is better. Or maybe you think both of them are horrible. Who knows, right? But you can reflect and rephrase back what you're hearing. That way the person knows that you're actually listening to them if you are hearing it correctly and you're interpreting correctly, right? And if not, then that's a time and a moment for them to say, actually, no, that's not what I'm saying, right? Last one, summarize. Different than rephrasing. Summarizing would be, okay, what I've heard you say tonight is, even when you disagree with it, right? You can summarize it. That lets them know that you're listening to them, you're hearing them, you still be in disagreement, and we don't always have to land on the same page. But that also then lets the other person know that you've actually been hearing what they're saying, right? Not just literally hearing with your ears, but soaking in what has been said and trying to comprehend from their perspective, right? Now, next slide, just a few examples. There are hundreds of ways of doing this. The mixed space, myself in particular, are not trying to tell you that these are the ways to do it or the ones to use, but a few effective listening statements, right? The first one, from your point of view, and then you finish that up, right? You would say something like, from your point of view, I'm hearing you say that, right? And then that's letting you know that you're articulating, I'm just trying to gather what you're saying from your position, right? Adiel, do you want to read the next one just so people can hear it?
Yeah. So the next one is, I really hear you saying that.
Yes. Right. And then, of course, you just finish that off, right? Whoever Adiel is in disagreement with, it doesn't have to be a big, huge fight, but that's one way to rephrase things and let people know that you're effectively listening to what they're saying. And then a quick, just last two, right? I'll read these quickly because we want to jump into our full group discussion, but could it be that, right? And maybe there's confusion or we feel there's confusion in the conversation, and you can just frame it by saying, well, could it be that you're saying this and I'm saying this, but we're kind of actually saying the same thing, but we feel like we're not actually on the same plane, right? And then the last one, let me see if I'm with you, right? And that would be rephrasing what you're hearing, right? This is a good rephrasing statement. Let me see if I'm with you. You're saying that, and whatever the disagreement, argument might be about, right? And then, of course, the last thing I want to say about this before we jump in and hear from you all in this larger group discussion, in talking circle practices, the assumption should never be that if you learn these skills, that you just won't have arguments or disagreements. You put humans in a room or a space together, and there are going to be disagreements. It doesn't matter how much restorative justice they've learned. It doesn't matter, what their religious background, their spiritual background. It doesn't matter, what they did that morning. We can always wind up in a conflict, and it's how you approach the conflict that's more important than do you just never have conflict, right? Because conflict is going to happen. It's going to surface. Okay. So, all right. So thank you for bearing with me through that. It's just a little glimpse into that line of work that I've done in the past and do currently as well. And so I just wanted to share some of that with us to kind of set the tone and ground us a little bit and maybe get you all thinking about things that you've done, right? Because we want to hear tools, tips, and tricks that you all possibly use that could be different from this or similar to this, but maybe done in a different way, right? So thank you for listening to that short presentation with us and by me. Thank you.
And so, as Mike just said, right, now that you've heard a few examples for navigating these kinds of conversations, we want to hear from you. So I'll just kick off and ask the group, how do you manage family political discourse in a constructive way?
One thing I wanted to mention, just my responses to your suggestions. One is about like the article that you can have. One thing that my family likes to use is the speaking stick. When someone's holding it, they have the attention and they're not to be interrupted. Okay, so like, yeah, that listening thing, allowing someone to complete their thought. But even before that, I like to enter a conversation. Sometimes they're spontaneous, but especially if we find that there is conflict, get an agreement. Meaning, are you willing to discuss this? If they're not willing to discuss it, then, maybe later. We need consent. And maybe a person will say, you know what, I'm going to need a minute. I'm too heated right now. We can talk about it later. And I also do think it's important to, like, if you need to blow off, to agree to come back, So that's a couple of my ideas. Thank you.
It's also really intriguing to me in talking about the talking stick that sometimes adults need to be reminded of those tools that we give kids, like it's really quite intriguing to me that we would bring a talking stick into this conversation. And yet I know if I were to implement a talking stick, my father and my brother would absolutely be like, no, we're not children, and then continue to talk all over each other, which is just so funny.
Me and my sister used to fight all the time. We used to get bad, like it got physical, but we've grown a lot. So what's helped me from remaining cool and calm when we have a disagreement is definitely like breathing techniques and like learning how to breathe like through things. When I'm upset or angry, it helps me like control my emotions so I don't just like build up and then I snap and do something crazy, because we've gotten to that point. But that's definitely helped. We have a really good relationship now, me and my sister. Just breathing through things and just like making sure that I'm in control of myself and not letting my emotions control me. It's definitely a skill, but I think it's the best skill you could have as a human, is like being in control of your emotions, So that's something that's helped me, is definitely like breathing techniques and just like really being in tune with my emotions and not letting them run me. So that's something that's helped me. So I wanted to share that with you guys. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I have a 5-year-old son, and once I notice things are starting to get spicy, it's not exactly always, I can never usually say what I want to say, especially because there's a 5-year-old listening. There's there's a youth there, and he might not quite understand what's going on. So something that I'll do is like, why don't we go outside to the backyard and just start playing? And that'll just be good for a way for me to interact with him. And also to let out some stress by like kicking the ball or just play some foursquare in the back. And then, so that helps my body. But then I'm also kind of able to be like, hey, it was getting kind of loud in there. Or, hey, that was like making my heart race. How does your heart feel? So like just checking in with each other's body has been really helpful. And literally letting it out. So I might encourage a dance party next time or something. And I think what I'm hearing from here is that the agreement before, I think it might be nice to do that with my son, to like, whenever things start getting a little uncomfortable, why don't we have a plan together? And I think we can do that with our siblings or with someone that we trust, maybe a parent or a cousin or a friend that you bring over to a party. And I like that we're connecting. So thanks so much for listening.
I want to encourage us to consider that young people or kids, as we call them sometimes, children, understand, but they understand from the child's perspective, right? Mm-hmm. So in a very adult-centered world, especially like at schools, it's we see things as like, well, you either understand from the adult perspective or you just don't get it, so we have to remember that. And then really what we're talking about here is what I call brain breaks. When you start getting like wound up, because a conversation doesn't feel good, it's time for what I call a brain break. Do something else, shift the brain so that the neural system can start to calm down, and then from there re-engage the conversation again, right?
I haven't been a part of like a family holiday meal in a long time. I think at least 3 years. And so this is my first time re-entering one. So I'm here to like learn other how other people, navigate it. But I guess this is just kind of something I've been practicing in general over the last couple of months. I moved back in with my parents. I've been living in Texas for the last year, and so I'm back in Southern California, living with them. And so there have been multiple times where we've gotten into arguments and discussions. And as somebody, I identify as a woman, assigned female at birth and what have you, and I have that experience. And so therefore I have the experience of being socialized as femme. And with that being said, like as femmes, like we often encounter being shut down, have our experiences invalidated and all of that, as well as our anger. And so I guess something that I've been practicing that's been very helpful to validate how I feel when I do get to the point of escalation, it's just like, okay, we get into an argument, things are said, it gets heated, and then like kind of like break away and then come back. And then I'll eventually say is like, you know what, I apologize for raising my voice at you because that's not what I wanted to do, but I'm still upset for X, Y, and Z reason, and so I guess for me, that's helped me like invalidate like my rage and like, I'm upset for a good reason, but I don't want to disrespect the conversation and what we're talking about. So I think that's something that I've been doing that's been helpful. And I guess I just want to put that out there for other folks. If it does happen, that could be a strategy you could use.
And I think especially as people who identify as mixed, we give ourselves grace because often our frustrations manifest in a tone or something like that. And it's often a way of talking, our body's telling us there's a trauma from our mixed identities from the past, be it a recent past to our whole childhoods, that needs to, be tapped into. And so I think that's like really important, giving ourselves grace, but then you give yourself grace and balance that with continuing to try the practice of, more peaceful communication. And I think what's also really important in this kind of concept of agreements is obviously the agreements you're having with other members of your family or participants at a gathering is also the agreements you have with yourself. I think so. In my case, I'm mixed. My mother is white American from Minnesota. My dad is Indian Kenyan, and I spent my early childhood in Kenya. And so with my mom's side, I am the token minority, the literal black sheep of the family. And it took me in college there was this concept I heard of, it is not the responsibility of BIPOC people to educate the majority, and in the United States, this case, white Americans, on the history of racism and how to be anti-racist. And I think, especially since I was studying international studies, this was always in my head. And so I always had this desire to like fix my mom's side of the family. And one thing I've learned is that there's times where there's been times in the past where I've talked to my mom's sisters and there's certain ignorances. And they're like, well, why don't you just teach us or these things? And I realized the emotional toll that has on me, feeling like I'm advocating for all people of color because, for them, they lump people, and me also saying I can't speak to that experience. And so calmly practicing the idea of the agreement I have with myself, which I don't have to tell someone beforehand, but let's say I'm interacting with an aunt and I say, actually, that's not my responsibility. I really appreciate that you're interested. I suggest, I've heard this book is good or actually read this book. Why don't you try this? Because there is a lot of emotional toll and sometimes feels like our currency. And I don't want to speak for everyone, but I think a lot of times mixed people in a family where there's a majority of another identity like white American side. And I don't want to dismiss the experiences of those who are mixed with two minority identities. But there is often a currency I feel our existence brings, and that we're supposed to be this reference point in an encyclopedia and Wikipedia of like race relations for the United States, because we're the walking solution. We created post-racism, but we didn't. And so giving yourself grace when you do get frustrated and practicing, the practices you're going to use to communicate better, but also not feeling guilty if you like say, I can't do this. And that's okay because it isn't your responsibility. And maybe there is a time you can do that, or maybe you did go to a good talk and you share a book with a family member later. That's okay, but also not beating yourself up for that, because I know I struggle with a lot of, trying to do things right, because it's really important for me to check my anti-racism as a person of mixed identity, but also knowing I'm human and it's going to be an ongoing journey. Therefore, everyone else has the right to their ongoing journey and same access to resources.
The difference between asking questions and questioning someone, right? So, asking questions like, oh, can you tell me more? I disagree with you, but can you tell me more about that? Versus, a questioning, phrase that somebody could put together.
I think whataboutism is a good example of questioning versus asking questions. So if a marginalized person is speaking on, some marginalized struggle issues, it's very common for people to do the whataboutism. So let me think of an example. Like I thought of, there were like allegorical figurative metaphors online. It was like, if your house is on fire, say, well, other people have houses on fire. Like, well, I'm blind and I'm disabled and there are people in wheelchairs, there are people who are deaf. Like whataboutism, it tries to minimize your pain and your struggle by pointing out that other people have pain and struggles, which isn't helpful, because it's two truths can be the same at the same time. So, and struggles are not always like the same in the same way with the same impact. So a lot of times when I'm trying to not argue, but discuss and educate about, marginalization and intersections that I have in my identity, that's often a common tactic, especially when I argue about feminism. Like, well, what about men's struggles? I talk about Black struggles. Well, what about people racist to white? Reverse racism, that's a classic one. And queer struggles. Well, you guys are just trying to force your way upon us. It's like, it's okay to be gay, but you guys are so obnoxious about it. Like, so whataboutism is very like, right now we're talking about my struggle. It doesn't mean your struggle doesn't matter, but I have the center floor.
All right. So that's it. Our meetup is officially over. A little bit of hangout time. I'm going to hang out for a little bit. Next up is usually what we call community hour. That is our evening for tonight, you all. We really appreciate everyone who hung out with us for this entire time.
Thank you so much for joining us, and I will see you all